Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Patrick Radden Keefe to discuss Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, published by our friends at Doubleday Books. Patrick Radden Keefe is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author most recently of the New York Times bestseller, Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2019 by the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal, and was named one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade by Entertainment Weekly. We had the pleasure of hosting Patrick at our Coral Gables location for the launch of the book, where he spoke to a packed house and autographed hundreds of copies. Tonight, we've got a packed house. You can't see them, but the warmth and interest are here in our virtual bookshop. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by the wonderful Robert Kolker. Robert is the author of Hidden Valley Road, a nonfiction instant #1 New York Times bestseller and selection of Oprah's book club that was named a top 10 book of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Slate, and was one of President Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020. He is a National Magazine Award finalist whose journalism has appeared in many publications. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Empire of Pain from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hey, Bob.
Hi, Patrick.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. And hello to everyone out there, and hello to Books and Books. I wanted to thank you, Patrick, for the invitation to come and talk with you. It's fun to be on the idea of being on a Zoom with you, who we haven't met personally, but you've had such an exemplary career, and your work is something I've enjoyed and learned from for such a long time. So I'm really, really happy to be able to learn from you tonight. And also, I've been waiting a while for Empire of Pain since I first heard some things about it. About a year ago, I was talking to the publicity department at Doubleday. Patrick and I share a publisher, Doubleday, and your book came up, and I started to hear, Patrick's got some things. He's found some things. And I'm thinking, oh, really? What's he found? And then later on, I heard, Patrick, that we're embargoing the book. We're not giving it to anybody until it's published. I'm like, really? What's he got? So I was very excited to read it. And so was everyone else. And the reception for it has been so wonderful. As I was reading it, I have to say, I looked at the back and I started to read some of the write-ups of it. And I saw in the New York Times, Jennifer Salai praised Patrick's exacting and terrifying lucidity, talking about how his story was expertly constructed out of complex and contentious material and arranged and imbalanced just so. And then I realized that this was, I wondered, how did the Times Review get in here so fast? And I realized that's for Say Nothing. And of course it is for Say Nothing, which is such a stupendous book. But you really could say the exact same thing about Empire of Pain. It has an exacting and terrifying lucidity, and it is expertly constructed, and it does have contentious material, and it is arranged and balanced just so. Just by way of introduction, I'll say that it is about the Sackler family. Patrick has said before in interviews that you could say it's a family saga, but really a better way perhaps of looking at it is as a crime story. But by my reading, it's also really a group portrait of a family with a particular culture and ethos and pattern of behavior. Patrick talks about a cultural denial almost in the family that repeats itself almost poetically over successive generations. And to see that all unfold is really something. When I picked up the book, a book like this that's supposed to be to make a case, there's a bit of a show me feeling that you have when you pick up a book like this and you say, okay, so what's he's got? What does he have? What does Patrick have? And my personal feeling was, we all know opioids are bad, but the challenge of a book like this would be to pin the problem solely or primarily on the Sackler family. And at around the time that Patrick was first getting into his reporting, one of the major arguments of the family was, don't make us scapegoats. We know that opioids are a problem. It's not our fault. Lots of bigger drug companies do it. Why pick on us? And what I loved about Empire of Pain is how you take those questions very seriously. And in my mind, everything about the book is sort of pitched toward the answering of this question, not just why is this a problem, but why is the family at fault and how? And you kind of build your case brick by brick, showing exactly where the transgressions occurred, when lies took place. You see an entire company wrapped up in a marketing and regulatory conspiracy. And the case is laid out clearly. And there are a lot of documents and emails and smoking guns. But to me, the thing that really made me shudder was a moment where David Kessler, the former FDA chief, talks about, he says that the destigmatization of OxyContin is one of the greatest mistakes of modern medicine. And when you read this book, you realize that there is one entity really responsible for the destigmatization of OxyContin, and that is, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. And it's just stunning to see that. But also, when we talk tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you never really lose sight of the Sacklers as individuals, as people with motivations and quirks and hypocrisies. And how, to me, that only makes your case stronger, because you get to know them as individuals and not as just a group. That's my little flyover for the audience, and I'll speak less now and just start asking questions. I thought I would start, though, and we talked before over email about how there's a little bit of overlap in some of the stuff that we've studied in our reporting in the past. But before that, I thought I'd ask, we're both in magazines and both, long form nonfiction writers, both in books and at magazine length. And I always have this moment personally, when I'm working in the middle of a magazine story and I think, there's so much more here. This is a book. And then the story comes out and I go, what was I thinking? That's not a book. And I walk away. But so that, to me, that's almost like there's a saturation point where you make the decision and take the leap. And I thought I'd ask about that process for you, given that Empire of Pain started as a New Yorker magazine story.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I should say, first of all, thank you to Books and Books for doing this. It's true that I was at the Coral Gables store. It was the last thing I did before COVID hit, and so I have very fond memories. That was my last excursion out of this room. It feels like more than a year ago now. So it's a pleasure to be back with you virtually. And Robert, I'm so thrilled to be doing this with you. As you said, I feel like we've kind of known each other virtually for a long time, but never had the chance to meet in person. And I've admired your work for years and years. And I feel as though I just feel some sort of affinities with your work. I hope that's not self-regarding to say. I think we kind of tend to approach things sometimes in a similar way. And I didn't read Hidden Valley Road when I was working on my book, because I worried that it would just kind of, it was close enough in some respects, totally different project, but a book about a family, and a book about the history of mental illness in a way, and ways of dealing with it. And that's, there's a kind of a part of my book that delves into that. So I waited until I was pretty much done, and then was just thrilled and humbled to read it. And like everything you do, just remarkable. So this is a treat for me. I write for the New Yorker, and part of what I love about the job is the metabolism of it. I think different people are wired different ways. And, there are newspaper reporters I know who couldn't imagine spending more than a day or two on a story, they love the churn. They love to just kind of get into something and get out of it quickly and move on to the next thing. And then there are people who write books who really are only comfortable at this sort of slower pace, where they spend 3, 4, 5, 10 years on a project, and get it just so, and put it out into the world, and then immerse themselves anew on a long, years long project. I love about magazine writing that it's pitched somewhere in between, that you can kind of parachute into a world you know nothing about and fully immerse yourself and kind of get smart and talk to as many people as you can and try and find the story. And that might take 3 months or 6 months, or, you know, in my case, occasionally a year. And then you write the piece, and mostly what I love about it is you walk away. And I don't have a beat. There's no terrain that I keep coming back to. You know, I think if you wanted to be less generous, you would say I'm a dilettante. Like I don't have a area of specialty. But occasionally there are these exceptions where I'll finish a piece and just feel like and it's a cliche, but it's the tip of the iceberg thing, where I just feel like or to use another cliche, like I'm scratching the surface, but there's so much more than what I was able to address. And this is the third book that I've written that's grown out of a New Yorker piece. What was different about this one was that when I finished the piece, I didn't know there was a book there. In the last two cases, I finished the piece and right away I said, my God, there's something bigger here. I have to do it. And with Empire of Pain, I think what I worried about, it's funny, I think a lot about access and intimacy and how you tell the story. And with Hidden Valley Road, I was very envious because you had this incredible access. I mean, to tell the story of a family, it helps to have a way in, and at least some family members who are willing to kind of unburden themselves and tell the story. And in this case, there's a family that didn't want to talk to me, didn't want anything to do with me. And in fact, at a certain point, started threatening legal action against me. So the question for me became, how could you tell a story without their cooperation that would still feel vivid and intimate, and you'd be able to distinguish these people as individual characters and write about them with, with a certain authority, having not met them, mm-hmm. and in light of the fact that they're trying to stifle the project. And the answer for me was kind of twofold, and it happened gradually, quite a while after that New Yorker piece came out, that people were coming out of the woodwork reaching out to me who had read my piece and who knew the family. So that was one thing, I can claim no credit for this, but people found me and said, I have a story to tell, who might not have known to find me prior to the publication of that New Yorker piece, but that drew them to me. And then the other thing was that the state of Massachusetts, by 2019, pretty much every state in the country was suing Purdue Pharma for its role in helping precipitate the opioid crisis. But Massachusetts was the first state to actually sue individual members of the Sackler family, which own this company. And in doing so, Maura Healey, who's a character in the last third of the book, the Attorney General for Massachusetts, she put together this just blistering complaint. It's like 250 pages long, and it has all these internal documents that she'd gotten. And so for me, this was this revelation, having spent all this time thinking about the family, to be able to read their emails, and kind of hear their voices in a way that I hadn't heard their voices before. And so that persuaded me both that that there was a way to do it. And then also, it seems, it's a strange way of talking about this, but also that I kind of had an obligation to do it, that I just felt that what I was reading was so outrageous that somebody needed to tell this story, and hopefully tell it in a way that people would engage with and think hard about.
It's such an interesting calculus to make, right? You find you have enough material to get started on a book, and then you just have faith that the more you look, the more you'll find. At some point, you just have to start the engine and go, right? To me, I like to think of it as trying to outcome proof the book in my mind so that I can sleep at night, so that I can think, well, even if I don't find 5 of the 10 things I'm looking for, at least I'll have the other 5, and that'll be enough. I'm certainly the Massachusetts litigation must have given you that confidence. It sounds like
it did. I mean, that was just the beginning. And there were lots and lots of things that came subsequent to that. A lot of other documents that came out in discovery. I mean, there were tens of thousands of pages. I mean, there was enough of a volume of information that when I was writing my note on sources and I was thinking about this, I had to actually do some math and decide that I shouldn't say hundreds of thousands of pages, that I should keep with tens of thousands. But it was a huge volume of material that that came out through litigation, and also that as I got to know people started leaking things to me. And so, yeah, I had to kind of take a bit of a plunge, but I feel like I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this. And you've been writing for magazines longer than I have. But I feel as though one thing I've gotten better at over the years, and it's more of an intuition thing than anything else, is just knowing when those pieces are there, kind of knowing the sorts of things you're going to need, and then developing a kind of intuitive sense of between documents and people who will talk and other types of material, archival stuff. It's all a big compost heap, basically, of stuff. But I feel as though I've gotten pretty good at knowing when there's a critical mass of it, and it's enough, you know?
Yeah. The phrase critical mass gets used a lot when I talk with people about, and hear from people about, do you have enough for a story or enough for a book? Do you have critical mass?
Yeah.
The only other ingredient besides critical mass I think about is a rationale, or I guess you could call it an angle that feels, fresh and necessary, so that sort of, for me anyway, that keeps me sleeping at night thinking, well, at least I'll have a book that's doing something in a way that's different from the way other people are doing it. And you definitely have that with a focus on the Sacklers. You said that you, as a writer, you jump from subject to subject, and that's certainly something I've experienced with. Each time you're jumping into a very crowded field of people who are covering the story very professionally and doing it full time. And so the question is, what do you have to offer? What I loved about Empire of Pain is that you are naming something. You are naming the family. That it is a family-centered argument about the opioid crisis in a way that the other stuff has not been as great as the other stuff was. Would you agree with that? That is as a defining position?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I thought a lot about this. And it's funny, there are continuities and discontinuities between this book and my last book, Say Nothing. But Say Nothing was similar in the sense that there was this vast literature on the Troubles, even more so in that case. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, many of them very good. But I felt as though the book that I wanted to read didn't exist. And so I would write it. And so a lot of what I was doing with that book was kind of stubbornly defining it in contrast to everything that existed up to that point, which is it's not to cast aspersions on that, all those books, which are great. I just wanted to do something slightly different. And in this case, the same would be true. So, I write about it in the book, but I mean, Barry Meyer published a great book called Painkiller in 2003, like almost 20 years ago, in which he talked about Purdue Pharma and OxyContin and named the Sacklers. Sam Quinones wrote a great book in 2015 called Dreamland. There are a bunch of other books about the opioid crisis, which I could name, which are terrific. I think what was strange for me was when I started work on the New Yorker piece, I was aware of I read all that stuff. And it described the Sacklers. But when I looked out in the world, it seemed to me that none of that had caught up with them. They hadn't been asked to really account for it. They could just kind of pretend it didn't exist. And in fact, as I started reporting, what I learned is that, like, at Tufts University, where the Sacklers had given a lot of money, and there were a number of facilities named after the Sackler family, Sam Quinones' book comes out. It's this, it's big, it won awards. It sold very well. Lots of people talked about it. Very highly regarded book. And Tufts briefly considered making it required reading, I think, over the summer for some of the students there. And the administration quietly scuttled that idea because they said, it would be uncomfortable for our donors, the Sacklers. So in some cases, it was actively suppressed. And so for me, in the first instance with the piece, what I wanted to do was write a story where there was, no place to hide. Like I thought about when I was a kid, and you do school plays, and there's always some kid who's kind of in the back, like somewhat hiding behind the tree, or the sort of the stage set. evading the spotlight. And I sort of felt like that was the Sacklers and all of this stuff, is that they were always there, but they were in the margins of the story. And for them to be there, but in the margins was enough in a way for them to continue occupying this pretty vaunted role in high society in New York and London and other places. So I just wanted to be tight enough on them that there was no place to hide. And with the book, I think that was still the operating assumption, but I also was just, I liked the idea of just like a big multi-generational family saga. There was a very deliberate choice to devote really the first third of the book to Arthur Sackler, one particular family member who dies before OxyContin is ever introduced. So I was thinking a lot about how I wanted to do something that was distinct from what had come before.
And that structure was something you had in mind early on, Matt.
It was, there was it's a funny story. I was trying to figure out the structure. I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time with Arthur. And I should say, for people who haven't read the book, originally there are these three Sackler brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond. They're born to immigrant parents. They grow up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression. They all become physicians, but also businessmen. And Arthur is the oldest brother, and he's kind of the paterfamilias figure. And he's starting businesses left and right, and he was very involved in medical advertising in the 1950s. He was kind of the Don Draper of pharmaceutical advertising. And he lived a fascinating life. There were all these women in his life and all these conflicts of interest, and he was very secretive and collected all this art, and he put his name everywhere. But it wasn't a situation where it was like, oh, here's this eccentric uncle I've found, and I'm going to devote, 150 pages to him or whatever it was. What was interesting to me about Arthur is that in his life, his whole life was sort of the preamble for what happens with OxyContin. Everything he did in his life ended up creating the circumstances in which OxyContin could end up doing what it did later. It's
really stunning to read. It's like he wrote the playbook.
Yes.
And they just are playing out the plays.
Totally.
And for people who haven't read it, he's doing it with Valium, not with OxyContin. And so to me, it's both prelude and archetype, really, for how to do it, how they did it in the future. And there are Mad Men moments where one of his wives takes pills in front of him in a suicide attempt, and when he sees her next, he says, "How could you do this to me?" Like, that's something that you would see on an episode of Mad Men. He's, you describe him as innovative, showy, and a little bit shady, but he also is let's talk about the innovative part really quickly. Arthur trained at Creedmoor, a major psychiatric hospital in New York, in Queens. And that's in an era where the mentally ill are being used as test subjects for any number of therapies. And he arrives at pills as a possible way to do it. And it really colors everything that happens to the family since then. I thought I'd ask you a little bit about that time, because he's sort of stepping into the middle of a milieu that that has a slight overlap with Hidden Valley Road. We thought maybe we'd talk about that a little bit. This sort of running debate about whether to treat the mentally ill as test subjects and try to fix them with surgery or with electroshock therapy, or whether therapy is a better way to go. And he comes up with this third way that's going to be the magic solution to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I should say I'm nervous to even talk with you about this, because this is one small part of my book, and it's a field that you know much better than I do. But the riddle of schizophrenia and of mental illness more broadly totally preoccupies Arthur Sackler in the late 40s and early 50s, and he's working at Creedmoor, which is this state hospital in Queens, New York, which has 6,000 beds. So you have this kind of, this is sort of the peak of the tendency in the United States to take people who are mentally ill and confine them in asylums, which were depending on how you look at it, I mean, they were, it's, to one way of looking at it, it was a much more benevolent arrangement than what we have now, which is people living on the street or very often incarcerated. To another way of looking at it, it was these were kind of, as somebody says in the book, it was like a 6,000 bed prison. People who suffered from various forms of mental illness end up just kind of institutionalized for life. And so in looking at mental illness, the part of Arthur that was an innovator and was frustrated and had actually, like, he personally administered electroshock therapy thousands of times and found it barbaric. He had actually trained as a Freudian. And in some ways, I think he was probably sympathetic to the notion of talk therapy. The problem was that in a 6,000 bed facility, public hospital, it just wasn't an option. Like, there was no way to scale that kind of treatment. And so instead they went for electroshock therapy, they went for lobotomies, these very kind of brute force techniques. And he became convinced that pills were the answer.
To me, the big takeaway from those times is that everyone is sort of convinced they're on the side of the angels. And one of the defining features of the Sacklers, as you describe over and over, is this sort of tunnel vision, thinking that they're doing right, but doing well by doing good. And that therefore there should be no shame, no checks and balances, and no boundary lines between regulators, between advertisers. But it just gets more and more insidious. But it's all Arthur who sort of starts it all. I'd like to move on to Richard Sackler, who's Arthur's brother. And he really kind of defines the OxyContin era. And as a person, and as a in a narrative nonfiction book, to me, I really admire how you maintain a certain tension and unknowability about him in the beginning. It's depending on the various things he's saying. I'm sort of scribbling in the margins, like, is he simply a moron, like incompetent, or is he malicious, or is he just ambitious and in denial? But then later you see how high-handed and callous he can be, saying things like 59 deaths, that's not so bad. And then, just revoltingly cruel and stubborn to a point of never giving an inch about any sort of imperfection in the family. And so I wondered how important it was to you in your reporting to start out with a unified theory about Richard, or whether you were ready to let him sort of be whoever he turned out to be. This is sort of a process question, a nuts and bolts question as you're reporting. Like, who is this guy you're asking yourself, and what did you have any ideas about him as you went on?
Yeah, I mean, this was a hard one for me because, and actually, I mean, this is probably too nuts and bolts of a writerly observation, but there's three parts to the book, and Arthur dominates the first part, and Richard really dominates the second and third. And you do think a little bit about, for the reader, like, what's the texture of this story and these characterizations? You don't want it to feel completely uneven. And Arthur is somebody who I felt as though, I just feel like I have that guy's number. If you presented me with some random fact pattern and said, how would Arthur respond? I would feel pretty comfortable guessing. Whereas Richard kind of remains a cipher. There is something fundamentally unknowable about him. I interviewed many, many, many people who have known him and worked with him and for him over the years, been friends with him. I interviewed his college roommate, people he went to high school with. I read letters he wrote as a college student. I read, 800 pages of 2 different depositions that he did. I feel like I have I did a lot of due diligence, but there is something about him that's a little bit elusive. He has always been a strange guy socially in terms of the way he relates to others and relates to the world. I think even his own family would acknowledge that. I had this stroke of dumb luck, I mean, from a process point of view, which is that one day I got an email from this guy who said, hey, I read the article you wrote in the New Yorker. It might interest you to know that I was Richard Sackler's college roommate. I did not find it.
It does. It gets so much across the stuff from the college roommate. I'm sorry to interrupt though. Please go.
No, not at all. I mean, it was, but for me, what was wonderful about that, this guy's name is Richard Caput, and is that he he showed me a side of Richard that I hadn't seen at all, which is that here's the weird thing. These two guys meet in college, and they're both not loners, but they're both, kind of studious, brainy, not part of the in crowd. And they become fast friends and roommates. And I think what was wonderful is that there's like a set of characteristics that I knew Richard Sackler had from later. And Richard Caput showed me how at age 19 or whatever it was, those characteristics were actually kind of bewitching. That you could sort of fall in with this guy, and it was kind of magical. He's this rich kid who's smart, and he kind of, and the big quality that Richard Caput described, which I feel as though you see it again in a kind of awful way with OxyContin, is he would get an idea in his head, and where other people might think, oh, it would never work, or, oh, what about the risks, or, oh, there could be downsides, maybe I shouldn't pursue it. He would just plunge headlong after the idea. So there's a story I tell in the book about how he became really interested as a college sophomore in the physiology of orgasm. And at a certain point, Richard Caput is going to go get a summer job, and Richard Sackler says, no, don't do that. Let's just spend the summer, in medical libraries trying to get to the bottom of the scientific riddle of orgasm. And they drive around and they interview people and they do all this research. And Richard Caput describing this decades later, there was a kind of excitement about hanging out with somebody like that. And I wanted to introduce that quality in a kind of benign context. Because I do think there are family traits, and I think one trait that Richard Sackler shared with his uncle Arthur is a kind of an idealism, but also a sort of stubbornness associated with that idealism. So you like plunge out there and you have a theory, and then the world starts to tell you your theory is wrong, and you stick your fingers in your ears and you close your eyes, and they would not ever for a minute examine their own decisions and thinking, God, I may have made a terrible mistake.
One question I asked myself while reading about them both, and it comes across beautifully what you said, what they share, is how if they hadn't been quite so successful, if that just would have happened, and if there aren't a lot of many Sacklers out there who get by and are relatively successful, they have the second home or whatever, and they are just tenacious enough to put moral blinders on to get by. But because the Sacklers were super successful, because they created this drug that was such a blockbuster and that turned out to be so incredibly damaging, and because they covered it up, they simply are the gross, exaggerated example of that. It's just something I wondered to myself. But what he shares with his uncle Arthur is whatever good aspects he has are diminished with success, and all of his negative aspects are amplified with success. He just becomes more and more corrosive, and his tenacity turns into something much more malevolent by the end. It's amazing to see, and to see a whole life portrayed that way is really really powerful.
I'm glad you read it that way, because that was certainly the way I felt, and that I do think that there are these kind of character traits that Arthur has, and then Richard has. So much of this, I think, is about taking a kind of like a certain disposition that some people have, and it's like, what if you took it to its, its zombie movie extreme? Like, what if you took this and you just refined it and refined it and refined it, so that as you say, I mean, there are a lot of people who will put on moral blinders, or will, I think there are a lot of people I describe in the book who are kind of the enablers around the Sacklers, who should know better, but they keep taking the paychecks in order to support them and facilitate the things that they're doing. And those people would be a good example. I think they have a kind of a moderate version of this same character trait. But what is shocking, right, is that in the case of Richard, certainly, and I would say others of his generation in the family, they're having board meetings in which they're getting, their staff is coming and telling them about thousands and thousands of people who are dying and getting addicted. And again and again and again, they say, let's keep pushing the drugs. There's never a moment where they say, God, let's hit pause here and look hard at our own conduct.
Yeah. In a moment, I'll be looking at the list of questions. Please don't be shy and type something into the Ask a Question feature. I'll ask one more question to Patrick and then turn to that. The family becomes sort of hooked on success. They double down and then triple down on their strategy, no matter how bad things get. And to me, that's another amazing thing to watch. Like, it's not like they get terribly, it's not like they ever have a meeting where they say, it's time to get a little more subtle about this. Instead, they kind of push themselves out even further over the ledge. Their big argument that I thought I'd raise with you is not just that they're scapegoats, like I said earlier, but that essentially saying that painkillers like OxyContin are not like cigarettes. They're like guns. They use the gun defense, saying that it's the abusers who we should be angry at, not the people who actually make the item that's abused. And then at some point you say something really amazing, which is that the opioid industry spent 8 times more than the gun lobby did on making its argument. I thought I'd ask you about that argument and how it plays out, and also how you what you did to try to dismantle it or take it on in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this moment pretty early on when the family and the company starts to realize that they have this fantastically successful drug. I mean, this is a drug that's generated $35 billion over the years. And their big push for the drug was that it should be used not just by people suffering from very severe pain, but also moderate pain. So they really want to dramatically expand the range of people who doctors prescribe opioids to. And they have this strategy about how they're going to do it. And it's incredibly successful using the Arthur Sackler playbook. And they lie. I mean, people, I've interviewed these sales reps. They all go out and they keep saying, the drug's not addictive. It's addictive less than 1% of the time. There's no real scientific basis for saying that, but they say it again and again and again. And pretty early on, there's indications that it's not working out the way they thought it would. And to me, this is the most interesting moment. But what they do is not just the Sacklers, but the senior people at their company, and even the junior people at the company, they kind of default to this posture where they say, look, there's 2 kinds of people. There's legitimate pain patients who are prescribed this drug by a doctor, and they are responsible, law-abiding people, and they take it appropriately, and they never get addicted. And then there's junkies and drug abusers who are reckless criminals. Richard Sackler described them as the scum of the earth. They electively abuse these drugs, and that's really on them. There's this incredible Richard Sackler line I found in an email where he said, they want to get addicted. Like they choose to get addicted. And this is just so fascinating to me because I feel like inside a family and inside a company, that's a devilishly effective story to tell. And I think publicly for a while, it was an effective story to tell because there's a deep strain in American life where I think we have a kind of intensely libertarian notion that, if you're a firearms manufacturer, if you make AR-15s for a living, that's what you do. You make a gun that can, spray a lot of bullets in a short period of time. And then somebody uses the gun to kill a bunch of people. I think we as a society have basically decided, I mean, I think this is regrettable, but certainly our political leadership, our legal system has decided, don't go looking at the person who manufactured that weapon that's designed to kill people when it's used to kill people. Don't blame them. There's some bad actor. And I think that kind of ties into another thing we have in our culture, which is the idea of sort of individual responsibility, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, a kind of deep, I would say, like lack of compassion when it comes to the lives of others and the choices of others. And so there's this sense in which the Sacklers, I think, actually employed an argument that it was sort of a perfectly American argument, and it worked for a long time. They still make it. I mean, it's not really persuading anybody. There are some people, but it's much less persuasive at this point. Let's say a quarter of a century on, 500,000 dead people on, but they still make it. And I don't buy it. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why I don't buy it, and I've tried to be careful in the book about, even though they didn't cooperate with me, about presenting their arguments and sort of trying to help you understand the way they see it, and then explaining the way I see it. And so, for instance, they say nobody ever gets addicted to the drug when they take it in a doctor's care and they take it as prescribed and so forth, pain patients. And I'll give you one statistic. United Health, the insurer, had a filing in the bankruptcy court, Purdue's now in bankruptcy, in which they said that they did a study over about a decade, I think it was 11 years, and they looked at people who were customers of United Health, who were prescribed one of Purdue's opioids, and who subsequently were diagnosed with an opioid use disorder. So this is probably an underestimate, right? It's one insurer over an 11-year period looking at people who were prescribed the drug and then who were diagnosed. So that's definitely going to be a much smaller number than the number of people who are actually addicted. And they said the number that they found when they did the study was in the hundreds of thousands. So I go to the Sacklers and I say, help me understand this. Like, help me reconcile this with what you're saying about how nobody ever gets addicted when they take it in doctor's care. And they don't respond to that. They just, there's no response. They have nothing prepared. There's no way that they can parry that or explain it. So what I do is, I will lay out what they say for the reader and then, show you what I've found and you can draw your own conclusions.
Their position, though, is just remarkably consistent over generations. Just, the abusers are despicable people. They are the bad apples that are spoiling it for people who need it. And then there's a whole other storyline with OxyContin, which is the crusade to end pain, that there's a silent crisis of people in pain in our society, and there needs to be a medicine for them. Sort of the almost willing a market into existence, through a philosophy. Or through
I should say, I think that's half true. I mean, chronic pain is a real serious issue. And for me, part of what's so devastating is, I get emails every day from two kinds of people. I get emails from people who've lost loved ones to OxyContin. Almost every day I hear from somebody, awful stories. And I get emails from chronic pain patients who now say that they're worried that there's been an overcorrection. So what they say to me is, why are you attacking OxyContin? It's a perfectly good drug. Often their stories, I feel for them because they are in terrible pain and they're worried that with the kind of tightening up of things, that the pendulum is swinging too far in the other direction. They're not going to be able to continue to take these drugs. Very often these emails will stray to them saying, I'm responsible. Like, I'm not like these other people. I take it responsibly. But the irony to me is, I'm not a prohibitionist. I think these drugs can be very, very useful therapeutically, but I also think it was the kind of greed associated with the idea that you would prescribe them for everyone, not just people in very, very severe pain, for whom other remedies hadn't worked, that puts us in the situation we're in now, where some of these chronic pain patients who are dealing with afflictions that make it difficult for them to live their lives day to day are worried about their access to these medications, which they feel they need. And there's an irony for me in the idea that they come after me and they say, stop bashing the Sacklers, it's making it harder for me. And I'm like, they're the ones who got you in this situation in the first place, because had they been content with the smaller market, I honestly think that I think there would be hundreds of thousands of people who aren't alive today, who might be. And I think that pain patients wouldn't be as worried about continued access today.
That leads to all sorts of questions about the toothlessness of regulation, about how they kind of missed the ball early on and Purdue squeaked by with OxyContin without any real regulatory measures to help do exactly what it is you said they should have done. But for now, I wanted to ask, I wanted to get to, there's one question here. Jill wants you to cut to the chase and talk about the thing you learned that surprised or shocked you the most. She's while researching this book. And I wondered
the biggest, there were many things that shocked me. I've been in a kind of sustained, shocked face emoji state for the last couple of years. Probably the single biggest thing was, and actually it's helpful that we've just talked about this idea that for decades now, this family and their company have been stigmatizing people who suffer from addiction. And at a certain point in my reporting, I sort of thought I had a rough grasp of the family tree. I had always wondered, just statistically, probably somebody in the family suffered from addiction. And there was this kind of intriguing moment in a deposition that Kathy Sackler, who's a second generation Sackler, did, where she was talking about the 1970s and the heroin crisis. And she said, I've known people, friends, relatives who've struggled with this. I always wondered, who is that? What's that all about? And Kathy Sackler had a brother named Robert Sackler, Bobby, who died young. And when I started looking into him, he had been totally erased. Like, this is a family that's put their name up everywhere, but there's nothing about this guy, who he was in life, the circumstances of his death. He hadn't been memorialized in any way. And one day a source told me he killed himself. One day in 1975, he went to his mother's apartment on the Upper East Side. They quarreled, and he took a chair and broke a window and threw himself out a 9th-story window. And when I learned that from this person, I started digging in, and I talked to friends of the family, and I talked to a housekeeper. I ended up tracking down the doorman who was on duty that day when the body fell, and who used a blanket to cover up the body. And I learned that he had struggled with drugs. Robert Mortimer Sackler had. And to me, I think that was the most shock. I mean, it's naturally shocking to discover a suicide that's been kind of covered up in a family, but also the idea that he'd also been suffered by mental illness. It was so unsettling for me that there's a kind of person who the family had kind of raged about for all these years and maligned, and to think that there was someone in their own family who had suffered with these types of issues was deeply shocking for me.
That was a stunning section of your book, stunning and but also very sensitively related. You don't make too much hay out of it, but it sort of sits there in just the right way. Tonally, it works in the way that you're describing. But also, just from a reporting standpoint, I have to say, the reason you all should run and get this book, if you don't have it already, is that Patrick is the sort of person who finds the doorman, who gives you the real story, and who helps you understand exactly what this tragedy may mean in the bigger picture. And it really was just a marvel to see that part of it. I have another question here from Donna Howard. She'd like to ask, and this actually opens up into a great line of conversation about the pressures you faced while working on the book. She says, as an author, what do you do when your deep-pocketed subject starts tossing out legal threats? I imagine that's daunting, just as it's meant to be, but it's not just legal threats, right? You mentioned in your afterword about perhaps being actually intimidated in person while working on it, and more. So yeah, I'd like to ask about that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I should say these are not the first litigious billionaires that I've written about. So some of this comes with the territory, and when you write about very wealthy people, there's this whole kind of added infrastructure, which is that they have these very aggressive, often really unpleasant press flacks, whose job it is to kind of nitpick you and bully you and spin you. It's very often the case that you get these extremely aggressive legal letters. So some of that, I have a pretty thick skin for that stuff, and I expected there was some of that coming in. I've never experienced anything quite like I did with this book. They started threatening to sue me before I started writing. It was announced that I was going to do the book. It was one of these things where we started getting these legal letters. And on some level, privately, I'm like, come on, guys, I haven't even really started, give me a break. Like, let me get going on the book before you start threatening to sue me. There's a story that I tell at the end of the book, which Bob just referred to, where this is last summer now. I was at home, it was COVID, I was here. So my wife and my two sons and I were living in lockdown, basically. And we went out one day to run an errand, and a neighbor came over. We live in the suburbs outside New York City. A neighbor came over on a pretty quiet street. A neighbor came over and she said, hey, I don't want to freak you out, but there's this guy in an SUV who's been parked right up there watching your house all day. And we had this funny thing where we drove by him, and he immediately started looking down at his phone. And then we kind of tricked him. We kept going, and we turned around, we did a loop and came back. And when we came back, he was out of the car. He had clearly, as soon as he saw us drive away, he got out to stretch. I'm somewhat sympathetic with this guy staking out the house all day. There's nothing to see, right? Because it's like, I'm a writer, it's quarantine. Like, what's he doing? He came back another time. I did end up asking, I asked Purdue Pharma, the company, if they knew anything about this private investigator who'd been staking out my house, and they said, absolutely not. We would never do such a thing. And I asked the Sacklers, and they declined to comment. So honestly, all that stuff does is it kind of sharpens my mind and sharpens my resolve. And part of the story that I wanted to tell in the book was about how they've been using these tactics for 20 years. And so it was this weird thing where I was on the receiving end of this stuff, but I'm also talking about the ways in which they used these types of tactics 20 years ago to stifle reporting. I tell a story about how they got Barry Meyer, the reporter at the New York Times who was on this story. They went over his head and they got him taken off the story by the New York Times. There were instances in which there were whistleblowers and people bringing lawsuits. There's a story I tell about a woman who actually worked at Purdue as a legal secretary and became addicted to OxyContin herself. And there are these kind of bare knuckle tactics that they have used to suppress the truth for a long time. I should say I'm speaking from a position of privilege here. I write for a magazine that's been incredibly supportive of me. I write for a publisher. It's my third book with Doubleday. They've been very, very supportive. So I have advantages. Like when these lawyers write to Doubleday and write to my bosses at the New Yorker and say, Patrick Keefe is reckless. You should know this kind of terrible, reckless journalist that you've got, trying to kind of put a wedge between me and my employers. I'm pretty confident that they can look at my record and they know me and they're not going to cut me loose. But I'm also aware that I'm lucky, right? I mean, I was a freelance journalist for years, and if you don't feel that kind of rock solid institutional support, that's often when people say, you know what, I'm not going to do this story. This is getting a little too risky for me. And I think that's what this whole system is designed to do. So that, again, just in turn, just sharpens my resolve to keep pushing.
It's interesting and telling that I saw you said elsewhere that they only demanded retractions or changes to the New Yorker story after you announced you were working on a book.
Yeah.
That which is, I assume, a year later, more or perhaps a little less, but many months after the magazine article comes out, suddenly they have a problem with it because they know you're still on the beat. And the New Yorker steps up and orders a full fact check again, which is just another wonder. It's another great profile and courage there, and nice to see.
And I should say, it does not change a word. I mean, they do the whole next fact check and then say, nope, the article stands.
Yes, I'm pausing because I see a few new questions in the hopper. Let's see. Kylie asks, says, you've spoken about how the Sacklers themselves wouldn't speak to you for this book or participate in it in any way. Were there other sources you wanted to interview or documents you wanted to read that you weren't able to get access to? And how did you write or research around or into these gaps? And before you answer, I just want to point out to everyone that it's not just that he did a write around a family that wasn't cooperative. He did a write around a family that wasn't cooperative where there wasn't one single family member who cracked and talked to him, which adds to the degree of difficulty considerably. So stunning to have the level of detail that he has. But anyway, I'll let you answer.
Thank you. I mean, I did think that there would be one who would come through. I mean, I thought there has to be some third generation Sackler who's a little uncomfortable with the $100 million they have sitting in a trust that comes from this stuff. And I never found that person. It's a great question. Look, there's always people I would love to talk to who won't talk to me. There were many, many, many people that I approached for this book who, for one reason or another, refused to talk. There's a guy, Curtis Wright, who was the chief FDA examiner at the FDA, whose job it was to approve OxyContin for sale in the United States and to approve the marketing. And Curtis Wright ends up approving the drug in record time, approving all these crazy marketing claims. And then as soon as the drug is launched, Curtis Wright says, I'm thinking I might leave government. And within a year, he goes and works at Purdue Pharma for 3 times his government salary. I think he made something like $400,000 his first year. So I was really intrigued by the Curtis Wright story, and I wanted to know, that looks pretty corrupt to me. I wanted to know about the dynamics of that. And I actually sued the FDA in a FOIA lawsuit, and I got a judge in New York to order them to turn over thousands of pages of documents to me. But when I asked for all of Curtis Wright's emails, the FDA, this is just last year, the FDA said, this is when they've been ordered by a judge to give me stuff. They were like, it's the weirdest thing. Can't find anything. It all was either lost or destroyed, they said.
Did they type oopsie daisy?
Yeah, exactly. It's this, how bizarre. So I did call Curtis Wright. I talked to him for about 30 seconds. He was not thrilled to hear from me. He's somebody I would have loved to talk to if he'd come through. Look, the kind of write around thing where you're working around these obstacles and you have to create a collage and find other ways of getting at things. I love that stuff. For me, it's fun and it's a repertorial challenge and it's a storytelling challenge. The main thing for me is always, I always think about, there was a guy, I wrote a big story about a hedge fund manager, Steve Cohen, years ago, and he didn't talk to me. And after the piece, occasionally over the years, people would say, what was it like to meet Steve Cohen? People who'd read the piece. And to me, that was always the best sort of indication that I'd done my job, right? Was that I say in the piece that he wouldn't cooperate, but that when people remember the article, they feel as though it's a vivid enough picture that I must have met him. And so to me, that's kind of where the bar is. That's what you want to be able to do. And it means you have to work a little harder, but I think it's rewarding.
For sure. I'll say one more thing about the way you do it is that it's very, very easy to slip into a snide or even overly prosecutorial tone when you're writing about subjects who aren't, cooperating with you and who are being accused of things. And your restraint and tone throughout are really to be commended as well. You are building a case. It's very true. And you are calling out lies when you see them, but it's not, the prose isn't purple. It's not fussy. You're not glopping on the rhetoric to make your point. It all sits there quite nicely, which is nice to see.
Great to hear. Thank you. I mean, I thought about that a lot because I thought I feel as though the material itself should just kind of speak for itself. And if I was always putting spin on the ball, it would just be a bit distracting.
Yeah. I see one last question here, and this is sort of a forward-thinking question. Ivy is asking, she's a pharmacy specialist, and she sees a lot of people with a tolerance to opioids, and they're chronic patients who really need solutions. beyond medication or surgery or physical therapy. And she's asking if either of us have any insights on alternative healing modalities, but I thought I'd put it to you. In reporting this book, did you see a groundswell or a movement of people who are trying to find solutions beyond opioids for chronic pain? Is there anything that's gaining traction out there?
I mean, I think that there is, look, this stuff is very controversial and there's a huge amount of debate about it. The CDC issued these guidelines a number of years ago over fierce objection from the pharma industry, in which these non-binding guidelines in which they basically said, look, don't go right to opioids right away. Try physical therapy, try other courses of therapy. This is something you should sort of graduate to. And part of the concern, as the questioner suggested, is that it is in the nature of these drugs, A, that they're habit forming, that you can develop a physiological dependence, which means that you're going into withdrawal if you stop using them. And one symptom of that withdrawal can often be a kind of a sense of the return of the pain that you're supposed to be addressing. That can blossom into addiction, where there's a series of behaviors associated with that, but also that there's tolerance, that over time you need to take more and more in order to achieve a certain level of equilibrium. If you're Purdue Pharma, that's a great formula. People are on it. It's not really clear how and when they get off. They need to take it forever, and they need to keep taking more and more. I think that's part of the reason OxyContin's been so successful. There are some doctors who really question the long-term therapeutic benefits of taking opioids, in terms of treating the underlying pain after a certain period of time. There are, I can tell you, other doctors, and particularly pain patients, who really resent that kind of suggestion and essentially say, look, I'm doing fine. As long as I can continue to take these, this allows me to live my life. I don't need you to intervene. I have sympathy with that point of view. So it's an excruciatingly difficult issue. And in some ways outside the scope of my book. I mean, there's a really amazing book that I'd recommend if you're interested, by Travis Reeder. It's called In Pain. It's an incredible book, and he explores these issues. He personally had a terrible accident and was prescribed opioids. And it's about essentially how we now live in a culture in which it's like quite easy or it became, I think in part because of Purdue's efforts, quite easy to get people on these drugs, but we never really figured out as a society or as a medical profession how to get people off of them. And so a lot of people are sort of stuck in that limbo. You say specifically in the book that doctors, by and large, aren't even trained in how to taper people off these drugs. They're not. And so what happened is you had this huge push to persuade doctors to get people on them, a push driven by the pharmaceutical industry, which was very successful. But then I do think that you end up with all these people who are kind of marooned in a way, because they are dependent on these drugs in order to live their lives. They're terrified of a return of pain or withdrawal if they do get tapered. And so they're really in a bind. And I don't know that I'm afraid I don't know that there are easy answers. And the background context for this is the opioid crisis is only intensified in the last year, since the outset of COVID. So, again, to the idea that in terms of the particular book that you write, what I wanted to do was look pretty hard at the perpetrators. And there are a series of really vexing questions that as a consequence, I don't address in a comprehensive way in the book.
Well, I'll end with one last comment from a reader, not a question, but a comment from Rebecca Wang, who says that she's read a few books on the opioid crisis, but never had a front row view inside the family. And she thanks you, and also thanks to the people who did the audiobook, which she also really enjoyed. So lots of options for reading this book, everybody. But I want to thank you. This has been great. I'll kick it over to Books and Books now to close us out. But it's been a real pleasure. I've learned a lot.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Unfortunately, Christina had a technical issue because of the storm here in Miami. But thank you both for this wonderful conversation, and for all the people who asked questions. They were amazing and great. And I just want to remind everyone, there's a green button to go buy Empire of Pain or any other books by Robert or Patrick through books and books. But thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thanks so much for having us. Thank you, Bob. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Yes,
everybody.
Christina Sons, thank you. Everyone at Books and Books, thanks you a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye.